The Ad Council.
You're listening to BostonFreeRadio.com.
Hello and welcome to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke, and Words on Film is a show to which you are listening on BostonFreeRadio.com and WBCA-LP Boston, watching and listening on Somerville Community Access Television or some community TV station that was kind enough to pick up this broadcast, and to them I say thank you as always, or you are watching and listening to me on Facebook Live, either on my own personal page or on Boston Free Radio's Facebook page. Either way you could join me. I'm glad you joined me to discuss my favorite topic, which is movies. And this is the first weekend that I can remember that no new movies came out in theaters in wide release. So because of that, I'm going to be reviewing three relatively new movies that are on Netflix right now and are available for streaming. One of them came out this past weekend. The other one came out a couple of weeks ago, over a month ago actually, and the third one came out months ago. And in addition to those three Netflix movies, I'm also going to be reviewing a classic film that got a nationwide re-release because of its 25th anniversary. First, however, I'm going to give you my first segment, which is What's Topping the Box Office. These are the top 10 highest grossing films of this past weekend. And amazingly, this is the first time since I've been doing the segment What's Topping the Box Office that this has happened. The top 10 last week are the same as this week. Many of the movies have held the same position. Some have fallen, one has risen. But all 10 movies are exactly the same as they were last week. And it's no wonder when you consider that no new movies came out in wide release this past weekend, but that will change come next weekend. So the number one movie at the box office this week was the same as the one last week and the week before, Ralph Breaks the Internet, which made a decent $16.3 million this past weekend in the US and Canada. Against a budget of $175 million, Ralph Breaks the Internet has so far grossed $141 million here in the States and Canada, and around the world a total of $258.9 million, making it not a hit yet here in the States and Canada, but around the world it is a tentative hit, and it only has just a little ways to go to become certified around the world. The Grinch is working at a budget less than half that of Ralph Breaks the Internet, and because of that it's doing really well for itself. It was number 2 last week. It is also number 2 this week, having grossed $15 million here at home. Against a budget of $75 million, The Grinch has so far grossed $223.3 million here at home total, and around the world $325.2 million, making it a certified hit here in the States and around the world, and opening it up for a potential sequel, which I would probably be willing to see. I'm not saying whether I'd like it or not, but undoubtedly a sequel is probably in the works. Creed 2, number 3 last week. Guess what it is this week? Also number 3, having grossed $10 million this past weekend here at home. Against a budget of $50 million, that's $50 million, Creed 2 has so far grossed $96.1 million here at home and $119.3 million worldwide, making it a tentative hit here at home, and around the world it is a certified hit. And it should be a certified hit here in the States and Canada by next weekend. Fantastic Beasts, The Crimes of Grindelwald. Number 4 at the box office last week. Guess what it is this week? Also number 4, having grossed just $7 million at the US and Canadian box office this past weekend. Against a budget of $200 million, that Fantastic Beasts movie, you know the rest, has so far grossed $145.4 million here at home and $570.5 million worldwide, making it not a hit yet here at home, but around the world it is a certified hit. It may become certified here at home, but the important thing is that it is a worldwide hit. Bohemian Rhapsody, number 5 at the box office last week, number 5 this week, having grossed $6.1 million here at home this past weekend. Against a budget ranging from $50 to $55 million, Bohemian Rhapsody has so far grossed $173.7 million here at home, and $596.3 million worldwide. And just 2 weeks ago, it was declared the highest grossing musical biopic of all time, not adjusted to inflation, which it is holding on to with a bullet, and it is a certified hit here in the States and around the world. Instant Family, number 6 last week, number 6 this week, having grossed $5.8 million at home this past weekend. Against a budget of $48 million, Instant Family has so far grossed $54.3 million here at home and $60.6 million worldwide, making it a tentative hit here in the States and around the world. Green Book was number 10 at the box office last week, and it actually went down a notch from number 9 2 weeks ago. This week it climbed to number 7, which means that the word of mouth is strong with this one. It grossed $3.9 million here in the States and Canada this past weekend. Against a budget of $23 million, Green Book has so far grossed $19.9 million here at home. I don't have the international numbers for you for this movie, but I can tell you that it is not a hit yet here at home, but it is off to a really good start. Unlike Robin Hood, which is number 8, which was exactly the same as it was last week, it grossed $3.5 million this past weekend, but against a budget of $100 million, it has so far grossed $27.2 million here at home and $65.7 million around the world, which means it is probably not even going to be a tentative hit. The Possession of Hannah Grace was never above number 7 and probably never will be. This week it fell to number 9, having grossed $3.2 million here at home. Against a budget of $6 to $9.5 million, somewhere in that range, The Possession of Hannah Grace has so far grossed $11.5 million here at home and $23 million worldwide. So even though it's only been out for 2 weeks, it is already a tentative hit here at home, whether it deserves to be or not, and a certified hit around the world. My guess is that even though we probably won't see this in the top 10 by next week, it will probably reach the certified hit status sometime in the next 2 weeks. And finally, Widows is number 10, dropping from number 9 last week and struggling, although not as much as Robin Hood. It grossed $3.2 million at the U.S. and Canadian box office this past weekend. Against a budget of $42 million, Widows has so far grossed $38.2 million here at home and $65.1 million worldwide, making it not a hit yet here at home, but around the world, it is a tentative hit. And it may not reach certified hit status, but of course we'll have to see.
When I was little, I didn't talk for a long time. I was sensitive to lights and sounds, so I built secret hiding places where they couldn't get in. Sometimes I do the same things over and over, until one day I found out I had autism. My family got me help. Slowly, I learned how to live with it better.
Early intervention can make a lifetime of difference. Learn the signs at autismspeaks.org/signs. Brought to you by Autism Speaks and the Ad Council.
Hi, this is Joanna Bremis, hostess of The Joanna Bremis Show here on Boston Free Radio at Somerville Media Center. Tune in every Thursday from 1 to 2 p.m. Please stay tuned for great music, first half of the show in English and second half in Greek. Thank you.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. And as I said before the break, long before the break, none of the films that I'm going to be reviewing for you this week are exactly new. I would probably say one of them qualifies as being new since it came out for Netflix streaming this past weekend, but many of them are not theatrical first run releases, at least nation or even worldwide. But the first 3 films that I'm going to be reviewing for you are available on Netflix right now. And I'm going to begin my first film as The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, which is the latest movie directed by and written by Joel and Ethan Coen, with 2 other writing credits in there. If you're interested, the other 2 writing credits, if you'll just excuse me, are Jack London, who wrote the short story All Gold Canyon, which is one of the short films that's in this movie, and Stuart Edward Wright, who wrote a short story that inspired the segment The Gal Who Got Rattled. So The Ballad of Buster Scruggs is not one continuous narrative like almost all of the other movies by the Coen brothers. It's actually an anthology series that's divided into 6 short films. One of them is The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, which is a comedy which stars Tim Blake Nelson as a cheerful, happy-go-lucky outlaw and misanthrope who wears a smile and also rides horseback and has a very good aim, but unfortunately his misanthropy speaks louder than his actual words. But it's a very entertaining first part of this anthology series. There's also another short film in this movie starring James Franco as an outlaw who's about to rob a bank that's run by a timid bank teller who's played by Stephen Root. That one is called Near Algodones, which also is wrought with irony, but takes itself a little bit more seriously than the previous Ballad of Buster Scruggs. There's also another short film after that that's called Meal Ticket, which features Liam Neeson in one of his few roles where he plays an American. And he is a guy who travels with an artist who has no arms or legs and entertains small town folks by telling them things such as the poem Ozymandias by Percy Shelley, as well as reciting works by Shakespeare and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, amongst other texts. And there's a certain story going on between the impresario, who's played by Liam Neeson, and this quadruple amputee whose name is Harrison. And I'm not sure if the actor who plays Harrison is an actual amputee. If he is, then he certainly made something of himself, being in a Coen Brothers movie. But if he isn't, I'm very impressed by the special effects that made him look like an amputee. The fourth short film in the series is about a lone grizzled prospector who arrives in a pristine mountain valley and decides to dig for gold. This prospector is played by Tom Waits, and it shows him both digging for gold day and night, and also him trying to stay alive in this wilderness. And there are certain unexpected twists and turns in this movie. And of course, very much like the other 3 short films, it is a story that is wrought with irony, but it also is very entertaining to watch. The 5th movie is one that takes itself a bit more seriously than the other 4 films, but it's still one that has a certain ironic twist to it. And it's called The Gal Who Got Rattled. And it's about a young woman whose name is Alice Longabaugh. And Alice Longabaugh is played by a young actress by the name of Zoe Kazan. And she is actually on her way to Oregon by way of a Conestoga wagon, or at least a group of settlers in Conestoga wagons. And she is going to Oregon under the pretenses that may or may not be false, that she's going to wed a wealthy landowner and eventually live off the fat of the land. But then she ultimately has a relative who goes with her that dies of cholera shortly after they embark. And there are 2 ranch hands with whom she develops a relationship, one different than the other. There's Billy Knapp, who's played in this movie by Bill Heck, who's an actor I wasn't entirely familiar with before I saw this movie, but he plays a good grizzled cowboy, not to mention one that has legitimate romantic interest in this Alice Longabaugh woman. And there's also the far more grizzled Mr. Arthur, who's played by Granger Hines, with whom Alice Longabaugh has a different relationship, certainly not one based on romance. And the 6th and arguably the final story in this anthology is one that's called The Mortal Remains, which takes place almost entirely in the back of a coach where there's an Englishman, an Irishman, a Frenchman, an American lady, and a trapper who are discussing what they do and their philosophies on life. I can't give away too much information, but the lady is played by Tyne Daly, which is a little bit of a random appearance. There's also an Irishman who's played by Brendan Gleeson. The Englishman is played by Jonju O'Neill, who's one of those actors whose name doesn't sound familiar, but you know him when you see him. There's a Frenchman played by Saul Rubinek, and the Trapper, the grizzled Trapper, is played by Chelsea Ross. And none of these 6 stories have really anything in common other than the fact that they take place in the Wild West and are inspired in one way or another by various filmmakers as well as various short story writers. In fact, 2 of the stories are directly based on short stories. And it's a little difficult to tell you exactly how these stories are, but they are intriguing in their own special way. It gets my rating of a knockout. It is another win for the Coen brothers, and one that I wish I could have seen on the big screen, but seeing it on Netflix is definitely good enough for me, and I think it's good that it's in bite-sized pieces.
I wasn't prepared to be a caregiver to Mom. I had no idea how hard it would be and what I would need to know. Things I never thought of, like how to improve her mood and ways for me to stay positive. Luckily, I found the Caregiving Resource Center from AARP. It had articles about the basics, but also information about the hurdles I was facing.
Caregiving Resource Center at aarp.org/caregiving. Articles, tips, and tools to help you both care for your loved one and care for yourself. Brought to you by AARP and the Ad Council.
Listen to She Likes It Heavy on Tuesdays at 10 p.m. Eastern on BostonFreeRadio.com.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The next movie I'm going to be reviewing is a Netflix film that actually just came out this past weekend. It came to Netflix on December 7th, and it was released very briefly into theaters a couple of weeks before. In fact, it may still even be in theaters, but rest assured, if you have a Netflix account, you can see this movie right now. So this is arguably, actually not arguably, it is the newest film that I'm going to be reviewing for you for this show. The film is called Dumplin, and it is a coming-of-age comedy film that takes place in a small town somewhere in Texas. It's directed by Anne Fletcher, who's best known for being a choreographer, which she's done in several movies, but she's also directed some hit-or-miss romantic comedies. She made her directorial debut in 2006 with Step Up. She then directed 2 years later 27 Dresses, which was an ill-received romantic comedy starring Katherine Heigl. She also directed The Proposal, which was a bigger hit critically and commercially, starring Sandra Bullock and Ryan Reynolds. Then went on to direct The Guilt Trip, starring Seth Rogen and Barbra Streisand. And she most recently, before Dumplin, directed Hot Pursuit, which starred Reese Witherspoon and Sofia Vergara, which I will admit, when I did my best and worst show of 2015, which was actually in 2016, way back when I started this show, Hot Pursuit was on that list. But fortunately, Dumplin is a much better movie. The film stars Danielle McDonald as Willoween Dumplin Dixon, who is an outcast in her small Texas town, primarily because of her weight. She is an obese woman. And her mother is Rosie Dixon, who is a former beauty queen, and is played in this movie by Jennifer Aniston. And the first thing you notice when you look at Jennifer Aniston and Danielle McDonald is, besides the weight difference, they don't look anything alike. And at first, it is a little awkward to see the two of them interacting as mother and daughter. I didn't quite buy it, but that is also part of the point. Not only is there a former beauty queen and also her daughter not even being close to your typical beauty queen, but they've also been somewhat estranged because of life circumstances, which wasn't made entirely clear in the beginning, which sets the movie off at somewhat of a weakness. But you're not shown in this movie through Danielle McDonald's narration that her mother was a little busy around town being a local celebrity. She's certainly a big fish in a small pond. But you then learn later that Jennifer Aniston's character not only is a local celebrity, but she also works as a nurse in a local hospital. So she's not exactly busy being a celebrity and neglecting her daughter. So I think having that narration in the beginning didn't set the movie off to the correct note, especially given that the narration didn't match up with the narrative of the rest of the movie. But in any event, Willow Dean, who's known as Dumplin to her mother, is actually raised more by her mother's sister, Lucy, than she is by her mother, of course. And there is a narrative in the film, sort of a subplot, that Lucy has instilled the love of Dolly Parton's music into Danielle McDonald's character, which I thought actually was endearing and gave this movie a bit more character than other coming-of-age movies, particularly ones that involve beauty pageants. But eventually, Lucy dies of poor health, probably of complications related to diabetes, but the movie doesn't exactly make that clear either. And going through Lucy's things after she dies, Willoween discovers that Lucy actually wanted to enter a beauty pageant a little while after her sister, Jennifer Aniston's character, did, but then didn't go much further than filling in the application. So Willoween eventually enters a competition, both to honor her late aunt and also a little bit to spite her seemingly perfect mother. And she also enters the competition with her best friend and probably more eligible best contestant, Ellen, who's played in this movie by Odeya Rush, who's an actress I've seen in movies like The Odd Life of Timothy Green and Goosebumps. And when I reviewed her in the movie Goosebumps, I said that she looks so much like Mila Kunis that her name should be Mila Klonis. But I think that actually the two of them work well together, Danielle McDonald and Odeya Rush. I believed that they were best friends. And there are other movies where there's a best friend who's glamorous, and then there's another one who's plain and therefore unpopular. And I couldn't buy the friendship of those characters, two or more characters, but I could in this film, and I think that presented a strength within the film. And there were various directions that I think this movie was going to go, or I thought that certain characters would develop certain story arcs, but fortunately, I think the movie did delve into some cliches of coming-of-age movies, particularly ones of beauty pageants, but I was actually pleasantly surprised that towards the end, they sidestepped some of them. And I was very impressed, most especially by both Danielle McDonald and Jennifer Aniston in this movie. I think that Jennifer Aniston is getting to that age where, yes, she's 47 years old and she looks amazing, but I think she knows, and the people who represent her know, that she's not going to be playing the romantic interest lead for the rest of her career. She still has about, hopefully, 20 years left in her career, and she's eventually going to be moving on to other things. And I like that Jennifer Aniston is branching out more so than Meg Ryan did, for instance. And Danielle McDonald, I was very impressed with when I saw her last year in the underrated Patty Cakes, and she does well in this movie as well. And there are certainly various twists and turns of this movie. It was somewhat uneven in tone, and some of the pacing was a little off, but I do give this movie a rating of a checkout because I was moved primarily by the performances, and this movie did venture into the right cliches and sidestep the wrong ones.
Okay, Sarah, I'm dropping you at Emily's, and Josh, you're going to soccer, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, and by the way, when I pick you up, I'll be wearing my short shorts.
What? No!
Yep, me and my short shorts doing my daddy dance. Your friends will love it.
No!
Well, I might change my mind if you buckle your seatbelts.
Okay, we're buckling up.
See, all buckled.
Whatever it takes, keep them safe. Never give up until they buckle up. A message from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the Ad Council. Visit safercar.gov/kidsbuckleup for more information.
Never Stop the Madness, Tuesdays at 9 p.m. BostonFreeRadio.com.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. The next movie I'm going to be reviewing for you is also a Netflix film, and this came out months ago, back in April. And I did see it when it came out, but I was unable to put it into the show. But I figure now, since there were almost no new movies that came out, even in limited release, I figure I review it for you now because it is worth mentioning. And even if it wasn't worth mentioning, I'd still put it on here. So the movie is called Come Sunday, and it stars Chiwetel Ejiofor, Jason Segel, Lakeith Stanfield, and Condola Rashad, amongst other fine actors in this movie. It is based on a true story, and it's actually based on a radio story that was broadcast on This American Life, which is on NPR, specifically the NPR affiliate WBEZ. I want to differentiate WBEZ from WBZ, which is the radio and TV station here in Boston that is a CBS affiliate, not a PBS affiliate. So the radio story upon which Come Sunday is based was produced by Alex Bloomberg and reported by and narrated by Russell Cobb. The screenplay and story based on this true story was written by Marcus Hinchey. And Chiwetel Ejiofor plays a real-life pastor by the name of Carlton Pearson. And for those of you who don't know who Chiwetel Ejiofor is, he is a black man, and he is pastor of a church that is actually integrated. It certainly has a lot in common in terms of style with a lot of black Southern Baptist church, but it is an integrated church that is comprised of both black and white and maybe any other race a congregation. So Chiwetel Ejiofor is British, but he plays an American in this film. And at first, he is a very successful pastor in this church. He not only has an integrated congregation, but also one of various ages. Old people come to this congregation, young people. They have a very successful rehabilitation clinic. And he also is married to a beautiful woman by the name of Gina, who in this movie is played by Condola Rashad, who is very beautiful. she is a good actress, yes, but she is also a knockout. But I'm just saying, the fact that she's beautiful does actually play a point in this film. I'm not just oogling at women on screen, but I have the right to do that since I'm not married. Okay, moving on. So eventually, Carlton Pearson sees a documentary on TV about starving children in Africa and believes that God is actually speaking to him. And this is something that does not sit very well with the members of his church, especially the higher-ups who are supervising him, as well as members of the congregation. Eventually, the various members of his congregation, both black and white, and other races that I couldn't see, but presumably, start to leave the church. And Carlton Pearson, played by Chiwetel Ejiofor, still sticks to his story that God actually spoke to him, like he did Moses and other biblical figures, much to the chagrin of his superiors, such as Henry, who's played in this movie by Jason Segel. So the movie's point is, what does Chiwetel Ejiofor's character have to gain personally or even professionally from telling other members of his congregation that God spoke to him? And is it a wise thing to do? Even if you think God spoke to you, or you're absolutely convinced, whether it's from a burning bush or from a TV set, should you tell other people? It's one thing to spread the word of God to other people, but it's another thing altogether to tell people who are following you that God spoke to you. And I can certainly understand Chiwetel Ejiofor's motivations, and I can also understand the apprehensions of Jason Segel's character, as well as other people who make appearances in this movie, such as Martin Sheen, who plays Chiwetel Ejiofor's superior, Oral Roberts, also a real-life figure. But I can't quite get behind this movie because when I hear somebody today saying that God spoke to them, I immediately think that they're arrogant, and I can't sympathize with someone who makes that claim, whether they are leading a cult or not. So that's why Come Sunday didn't exactly work for me, or didn't qualify as being a great film, but I did enjoy the performances of just about everyone in this movie. I did appreciate the ironic evolution of the marriage between Carlton and Gina Pearson, which you learn gradually through the first third of the film is more a marriage of convenience than of love. But then when Chiwetel Ejiofor's character begins to say these extreme things about speaking to God and then loses members of his congregation, what happens to his marriage after that? What happens to his relationship with his wife? These are all very intriguing questions, but I felt the movie was unevenly toned. And I think that the movie ended on, unfortunately, a note that felt more like a cop-out than it did a satisfying ending that really, figuratively speaking, clicked shut. So Come Sunday is indeed an interesting film that is acted very well. I can't say that it's based on a story that I think should have been made into a movie, but fortunately it has good actors creating the story. I just don't know if its message is supposed to be correct. If you're supposed to entirely sympathize with Chiwetel Ejiofor's character, Carlton Pearson, who is a real person who is still preaching to this day. I just don't know. But it does get my rating of a check out. If it weren't for the great performances in this movie, it probably would have been a strikeout. But I will give it a marginal check out because it does raise a lot of interesting questions at least.
It only takes a minute to find out if you may have prediabetes. And you can do it at doihaveprediabetes.org. But you're probably not going to, are you? Kids, work, listening to the radio. You're busy, which is great because busy people can't get prediabetes. Oh my, I read that wrong. They can. Should have worn my glasses. So visit doihaveprediabetes.org and take a short test because prediabetes can be reversed.
Brought to you by the Ad Council and its pre-diabetes awareness partners.
From the hub of the solar system to the world, BostonFreeRadio.com.
Diane Wong here, announcing a new radio program. Let's talk about race. From our beginnings as a white supremacist society to our current existence as a white supremacist society, race is a topic that affects us all, and yet we have difficulty talking about it. Why is race so difficult? Why can't we talk openly about white supremacy? Why don't we like to talk about white privilege? Why is internalized oppression shrouded in mystery? What about lynching? What about gerrymandering and the current Black Lives Matters debate? We'll talk about all of it. Come and join us Thursdays from 7 to 8 p.m. Let's talk about race. Boston Free Radio.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. And a lot of people, when I tell them that I host a show where I review movies, a lot of people ask me, do I review new movies or classic films? And there have been a couple of times over the last couple of years that I have reviewed classic films. Like, for instance, years ago, I think it was back in 2014 or 2015, when I was still trying to get the basic structure of this show put together, I did review Seven Samurai, which I saw at the Coolidge Corner Theater and absolutely loved. I saw it not only as a great film, which it is, but also as a blueprint for many other films, good and bad, that preceded it over the last 50 or 60 years since it came out. So that was one of the only classic films that I've reviewed for this show. There was also another show where I gave you my top 5 favorite films. And I was thinking of doing that again, but I didn't want to repeat myself, even though that show was over a year ago at this point. But this weekend, I did make it a point to go out of my way to see the re-release of Schindler's List, which Steven Spielberg and Universal Pictures actually re-released in, I wouldn't say select theaters. It's actually been a nationwide release. And when I went to see it in theaters, I was the only one in the theater seeing this movie, which probably gives me an indication of how well it did. And I also didn't see it in the top 10 of what's coming up next. And there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, it's rated R, which means that children under 17, in theory, can't see it unless accompanied by an adult. And secondly, it is harrowing. It really is. It's one of those films that a lot of people choose not to watch more than once. But rest assured, it's a film that is so great that it leaves a lasting impression on anyone who has seen it even once. And also, one of the things that separates Schindler's List from other films about World War II, and particularly the Holocaust, is it pulls no punches. It doesn't really sugarcoat anything about the Holocaust and about Oskar Schindler, both his character and also what he did to rescue a substantial number of Jewish people. Certainly there were people who worked under him in a factory, which he bribed German armed forces officials and SS officials to acquire these Jewish people to help him at first produce enamelware, that is pots and pans for kitchens, and then eventually when the other German officials begin to catch on to Oskar Schindler's potential plan to save Jewish people, he eventually creates a factory that produces weapons for the Nazi Party. And this movie is not so much a biopic as much as it is a docudrama. It certainly is a biopic. It's about an unusual man in dire circumstances, but it also gives you a lot of great information by way of documentary style about what became of Oskar Schindler, how his factories operated despite the Nazis controlling Germany. And also, Liam Neeson is brilliant as Oskar Schindler in this film, who's a shrewd businessman who is actually a member of the Nazi Party. He's an ethnic German from Czechoslovakia, which is now Slovakia and the Czech Republic. That happened in the early 90s, that separation. But it also shows that Oskar Schindler did not wear his heart on his sleeve. He was definitely rescuing a lot of people, including but not limited to Itzhak Stern, who was a local Jewish accountant, who's played in this movie brilliantly, I might add, by Ben Kingsley. And he doesn't wear his heart on his sleeve, even when it's just him and Itzhak Stern in the same building, or in the same room together alone. And that probably saved Oskar Schindler's life. It didn't save his business or even his marriage. He was, of course, a notorious womanizer, despite being married to a woman who is as committed as one would expect one to be. His wife in this movie is Emily Schindler, who's played brilliantly by Caroline Goodall. And there are also some other great performances in this movie, such as Amon Goth, who's played by Ralph Fiennes, who is not only dedicated to the Nazis and their Holocaust practices, but also is a shrewd sociopath. And anytime there is a person who gets shot in the head by a member of the Nazi Party, and remember, this is depicting the Holocaust, not World War II, so you don't see actually any war battles taking place in this film. But anytime a Jew gets shot in the head, I flinched, probably more so than I did even some of the best horror films that have come out this year. And it's a testament to how well Steven Spielberg made this film. And if you really think back to 1993, you got to remember something. Steven Spielberg not only released Schindler's List in 1993, he also released Jurassic Park, which was one of the top-grossing films ever made at the time, second actually only to another Spielberg film, E.T. And Schindler's List was not a huge box office success, but for a film dealing with the subject that it did, with a budget of just $22 million, and that's 1993 money, which would probably be maybe about $35 million today, it's impressive that he got these two huge movies out. One that was popular, the other one that was important. And I don't even think I need to give Schindler's List a rating, but it definitely deserved its Best Picture win and the other various awards that it won. I am so happy that Steven Spielberg decided to re-release this movie. And regardless of what age you are, if you have not seen Schindler's List, which is a knockout, by the way, that goes without saying, you must see the film. I think probably people 13 and older would be best seeing this film. I can't imagine that people 12 and under would either have the attention span or even have the thick skin to deal with such a film. But 13 years or older, I think, would be appropriate, and apparently so do other.
To protect her home and family in a disaster, Karen was willing to wade through water, mud, and insurance paperwork.
Yeah, I can do this.
You go, Karen! By simply understanding and updating what her insurance covers and doesn't cover now, she'll be better prepared no matter when disaster strikes. Learn other simple ways to protect your home and family before a natural disaster at ready.gov. That's ready.gov. A message from FEMA and the Ad Council.
Back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke. And now that I've reviewed all the films that I have to review for this show, it's now time for me to get into my next segment, which I'm starting a little early this show, which is What's Coming Up Next. This is a spoken word preview of movies that may or may not be coming to a theater near you. Some are coming out in wide release. Others are coming out in limited release, but I will let you know the difference as I go down the list. And the release dates are subject to change, just as a disclaimer. So last weekend, Hollywood seemed to take the weekend off. There were no films that were coming out in wide release, if perhaps you don't count Green Book. But Green Book started out as a film in limited release that has since expanded. And there was also the movie Schindler's List that is out in theaters this week. I'm not sure if it's going to be out for very much longer, but as I said in the previous break, that is a film that is very important to see. I would highly recommend seeing it on the big screen if you can. Remember, you're going to have a thick skin to see it, but it is ultimately a very important film that remains important 25 years after it's been released. So the other movies that are coming out in wide release are ones that are more entertaining. The first one, probably the biggest one, is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. And this is a movie that is not connected to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but it is actually an animated film. And if you saw the movie Venom this past couple of weeks, it's not out in theaters anymore, at least not in as wide release as it used to be, you would know that if you stayed towards the end of the credits, you would see a preview of this new Spider-Man movie. And it concerns a young boy not named Peter Parker, but Miles Morales, who becomes the Spider-Man of his reality and crosses paths with his counterparts from other dimensions to stop a threat to all reality. So what this basically means is that there are more than one Spider-Man. There is more than one Spider-Man. I'm not sure the grammatically correct way to say this, but that's how it is in this movie. And not only are there more than one Spider-Man, they also come from different dimensions, not just wannabe Spider-Mans who live in the same city and time period. So I'm very interested to see how this movie's going to be. Again, it's not connected to the MCU at all. So the whole thing with Thanos from Avengers Infinity War does not apply to this movie. But I will see this movie, and I will let you know what I think come next week's show. Another movie that's coming out, which is kind of remade and re-released, I'll explain a little while later, is Once Upon a Deadpool, which is a version of Deadpool 2 that is coming out in theaters tomorrow, December 12th. It's coming out in theaters. And it is a sanitized version of Deadpool 2 that also features additional scenes where Ryan Reynolds returns as Deadpool to read a story about Deadpool to Fred Savage, kind of like The Princess Bride. It seems like a gimmick, and especially since Deadpool 2 is already out on DVD and Blu-ray, I don't exactly see what the point of this is other than Ryan Reynolds posturing and saying, look how funny I can actually be. And I do think that even though Deadpool and Deadpool 2 have resonated well with audiences, and people have really, probably even more than accepted Ryan Reynolds as Deadpool, I still feel like Ryan Reynolds is one of those guys who still tries way too hard to be funny. But then again, this whole Once Upon a Deadpool thing was probably not solely Ryan Reynolds' idea. And a lot of people are kind of irritated by Deadpool as being, I heard one person proclaim it as Family Guy in Spider-Man's outfit. And I kind of agree with that, although I did enjoy Deadpool 2, and I did give it my rating of a knockout. I thought it was much better than the original Deadpool for a variety of reasons. But in any event, Once Upon a Deadpool will be out in theaters on Wednesday, December 12th. Will I review it? I'm still deciding whether or not I will, because I've already seen Deadpool 2. If I could just see the YouTube version of the Fred Savage parts, I might review it for you next week, but I don't know. That's a maybe. Another movie that's coming out this coming weekend in wide release is one called The Mule, which is directed by and starring Clint Eastwood. And interestingly enough, this, like Steven Spielberg releasing both Jurassic Park and Schindler's List in the same year, The Mule is Clint Eastwood's second film which he's directing, and the only one he's starring in, granted, but still, directing 2 films in 1 year is not an easy thing to do. The other film that he directed earlier this year was The 1517 to Paris, which received terrible reviews. I gave it my rating of a checkout, although I did acknowledge that it wasn't a great movie. and it probably should have been a short film rather than a feature-length film. But The Mule might be Clint Eastwood's redemption, but of course, we'll have to see. In any event, Clint Eastwood is... It's amazing that he's still directing movies when he is 88 years old. Yeah, at an age where Robert Redford retired recently at the age of 82, and Clint Eastwood is going to be directing and potentially acting in films until he dies. So I gotta admire Clint Eastwood's longevity. But The Mule is about a 90-year-old horticulturalist. Excuse me, let me say that again. A 90-year-old horticulturist and World War II veteran who is caught transporting $3 million worth of cocaine through Michigan for a Mexican drug cartel. This movie also co-stars Bradley Cooper, whom Clint Eastwood directed in a film that was a big hit a couple of years ago, that was a hit with audiences and critics, American Sniper, which, was Clint Eastwood's last, I'd say, great film he directed. The movie also co-stars Taissa Farmiga and Michael Pena. And Michael Pena, who seems to be in every single movie ever made, so it seems. But The Mule looks like a very interesting movie. I'm very curious to see what Clint Eastwood does with it. Hopefully it's a step up from the 15-17 to Paris. But The Mule is a movie that I definitely will see since it's in wide release. And I will let you know what I think when I come back to do my show next week. But again, kudos to Clint Eastwood. Even if this movie is a flop, he is still directing and acting almost into his 90s, and that's impressive.
What if I could tell you that a full-blown wildfire was going to occur tomorrow, right where you live? Tell you exactly which neighborhoods it would engulf and how fast it would do it. The first thing you would do is talk with your loved ones and make a plan today. It's true, I can't tell you a wildfire will strike tomorrow, but shouldn't you make a plan anyway? Visit caloes.ca.gov and make your emergency plan today. Don't wait, communicate. Brought to you by Cal OES, FEMA, and the Ad Council.
Every Tuesday at 3, something special happens on Boston Free Radio. Why, it's Toppers with your host, Gil. Toppers, spinning the tunes that today's youth demand, from Justin Bieber to Lady Gaga to the Fleetwoods, and, on occasion, Hoagie Carmichael. If you missed the program, you can check out the archives at Toppers Radio, that's one word, .blogspot.com. Toppers.
Welcome back to Words on Film, the spoken word show dedicated to moving pictures. I'm your host and movie critic, Dan Burke, and I'm continuing my segment, What's Coming Up Next, which is a spoken word preview of movies that are subject to come out in theaters this coming weekend. This coming weekend being the weekend of December 14th through 16th. I think I have that right. Yep, December 14th through 16th. Just a couple of weekends before Christmas. And I mentioned the previous films that are coming out in wide release: Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, Once Upon a Deadpool, and The Mule. There's one more that's scheduled to come out in wide release, and it's called Mortal Engines. On the poster of this movie, it says that it's by the filmmakers who brought you The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, which leads a lot of people to believe that Mortal Engines was directed by Peter Jackson. It actually was not. It was directed by Christian Rivers, who is making his feature-length directorial debut. But even though he's stepping into the director's chair for the first time for a feature-length film, he is no stranger to either Peter Jackson movies or working on a movie. As a matter of fact, he was a storyboard artist for all 3 Hobbit movies, all 3 Lord of the Rings films, King Kong, which I think was underrated, and also other less revered Peter Jackson films such as Dead Alive, Heavenly Creatures, The Frighteners, King Kong, I mentioned King Kong, and The Lovely Bones. And as a matter of fact, he did direct a short film called Feeder, where he also served as a storyboard artist, but this is the first time he's in the director's chair, again, for a feature-length film. And Mortal Engines takes place in a post-apocalyptic world where cities ride on wheels and consume each other to survive. And 2 people in this post-apocalyptic world meet in London and try to stop a conspiracy. The actors in this movie include Hera Hilmer, who I'm not entirely familiar with, Hugo Weaving, who I am familiar with, Jihae, his or her name is spelled Gihae. I'm going to pronounce it Jihae, and Robert Sheenan, amongst other people. So Mortal Engines certainly sounds like an interesting movie. I will see it, especially since it is coming out in the theater near me, and I'll let you know what I think come next week's show. This next film is coming out in limited release, but I think it's just in New York and LA. I know as a fact that this movie is coming out on Christmas Day in the Boston area. So this is a film I will not be seeing this coming weekend, but I will be seeing it by the end of the year. Unfortunately, you will not get my review until well into 2019. That movie is If Beale Street Could Talk. This is the follow-up to Moonlight by director Barry Jenkins, who is an Academy Award-winning director, even though he did not win an Academy Award for directing. In other words, he didn't win Best Director during the 2017 Academy Awards. Damien Chazelle won the Best Director award for La La Land, and unlike the original announcement for Best Picture, that award was not a mistake. Yeah, that was a very awkward moment, that Oscar telecast. But If Beale Street Could Talk is actually based on a short story. Well, I want to say short story. It was actually it's based on a novel written by James Baldwin. And it is about a woman in Harlem, a black woman, who desperately scrambles to prove her fiancé innocent of a crime while carrying their first child. The movie stars a number of actors with whom I'm not familiar. The lead actors are Kiki Lane and Stephen James, who might be relative newcomers. Regina King co-stars in the film, and that's one actress I do know, and I love her in just about everything she's in. And there's also another actor named Coleman Domingo. That's a film I'm very excited to see, but for the remainder of 2018, I am not going to be reviewing this film because I know it's not going to come out until well after I'm done my show next week. And by the way, this is not my last or next to the last show total, but it is my next to the last show for 2018. Next week's show, December... why am I struggling here? December 18th, which will be on Tuesday on Boston Free Radio, that will be my last show of the year, the calendar year. But I will be back on January 8th after that to give you my list of best and worst movies. And because I'll have 2 weeks off, I'll have plenty of time to review those movies for you.